A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISAS panel discussion titled India's One Nation, One Election Plan, the Challenges and the Implications. To discuss this topic today, we are delighted to have with us the following speakers: Professor Louise Tillon, Professor of Politics, King's College London, and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore; Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar, Associate Professor, Ahmedabad University in India; Mr. Shoaib Daniel, Political Editor, Scroll.in in India. And this roundtable will be chaired by Dr. Diego Mairona, Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies and US, and Senior Assistant Professor, University of Naples, Italy. Today's webinar will be live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I shall now invite Dr. Diego to commence the roundtable, please. Thank you.
Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, and thanks everybody for joining us today, especially to our three speakers for accepting our invitation to discuss what is a rather hot topic in Indian politics and one that could have far-reaching implication for India's political system and the functioning of its democracy. As I guess you all know, the focus of today's seminar is the proposal by the Indian government to hold simultaneous elections for the national parliament and the state legislative assemblies. One nation, one election is the name of the proposal slash slogan of the BJP-led government. The idea has been floating around for some time now, especially since Narendra Modi became Prime Minister in 2014. And it seems to have reached a critical stage as the Union Cabinet has just approved a bill that should be tabled in Parliament in the forthcoming winter session of the Lok Sabha, starting at the end of this month. It's not going to be an easy legislative journey, I'd say, as it will require significant amendments to the Constitution and as well as ratification by at least 50% of the states. Because the proposal is not just a way to consolidate elections, as many other countries do, when these are due pretty much at the same time to save cost and administrative burdens, but it's much more radical a proposal and potentially consequential. And I am frankly puzzled by both the reasons behind the initiatives. At my superficial level of understanding, it would not bring significant benefits neither to the country nor to the ruling party. And I'm also very puzzled about the feasibility of the proposal itself. So I thought that instead of doing the hard work of actually studying it and documenting myself, I thought that I could just ask three of the best people around, what is this proposal? Why are they trying to put it forward, and what the implication will be for the country and especially for its federal system? So I think I would like to start with Shoaib, who will tell us in greater detail what the idea is about and how it can actually be realized. And I will then turn to Nilanjan, who will try to dig into the reasoning and the political rationale behind the move. And finally, we will end with Louise, who will look at implications for India's federal system, as this seems to be one of the areas where the proposal would have the greatest impact. So each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A section to pose your question, and I will moderate and ask as many as I can to our speaker. So Shoaib, the floor is yours, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Diego. One nation, one election. So the BJP really likes taglines with one nation. It's one nation, one tax, one nation, one election. I think a lot of people have commented on how the BJP is a very centralizing force, and it really sort of brings that out with these somewhat cringy slogans and taglines. They've done that with GST. And now there has been a continued proposal for the consolidation of all three tiers of elections, which is both the union or the federal, as it is known internationally, at the state level, as well as in local bodies. Right through Modi's tenure, almost since the first year that he started in 2015, there was a joint parliamentary committee. Just a few months back, there was a Kovind report where the former president submitted a report to implement these elections. I'm not going to spend too much time on what it is, because I think most people who joined the seminar would be aware of what it is. It's basically just conducting elections of all three tiers at the same time. It's not a super new idea. Actually, for the first four general elections, you did have this, which is just a matter of coincidence. So since 1951, 52 to 69, you did have all at least state and central elections conducted together. And it was only in 69 when Indira Gandhi kind of pushed forward her elections. There was a bit of a political gambit that she played due to some internal politics within the Congress party at that time. She was trying to get a leg up on the old guard. That she forwarded elections, and this broke that cycle. Of course, that was a very, very different India. The Congress was hegemonic in India. Congress was a sort of umbrella party which involved state and central units, which often bickered and often fought. But at the end of the day, it was one party, and they split that. And in some ways, you can see that as a sort of almost a beginning of a sort of splitting of India's polity into federal units, state parties. I don't think that is the reason for it happening, but coincidentally, it does happen approximately at that time when state elections acquire a salience and prominence of their own, which is very different from the central elections. Niti Ayog. So ever since, this idea of simultaneous elections has been there in India for a very long time. Ever since that has happened, there are a number of reasons for it. The Kovind report has a reason which says that it's expensive to hold simultaneous elections. It reduces economic growth. I'm not too sure about that. The BJP's reasons are often alleged to be that centralized elections help, or one simultaneous elections help the party at the center. There is some very sketchy data around that, but I'm not really sure of that, especially in this day and age, where honestly the Indian voter is getting more and more sophisticated when it comes to split ticket voting, right? So this maybe was again true in an earlier age when the Indian voter was getting used to the idea of elections. But we'll have to look at that. I think Louis will look more in detail at that. I am going to look at a more deep dive into the feasibility of simultaneous elections. So the Kovind report, so firstly, there have been a ton of very inventive ideas as to how simultaneous elections are going to be implemented. So I'm just going to go into the weeds a bit here without going into the whys and the hows. I'm not going to go into the what. There have been a ton of ideas about how simultaneous elections are going to be implemented, because remember, India has a parliamentary system of government where legislatures do not have fixed terms. So unlike a presidential election, a presidential system of government, our legislatures exist as long executives exist as long as they have the pleasure of the legislature, and the executive can even dissolve the legislature and call for re-elections, which is what happened, which is why we don't have simultaneous elections anymore. That's the problem number one. The problem number two is India is incredibly huge. India is, as of today, we are officially the largest country in the world. So, we're number one there. We're the largest country in the world. We have a federal polity. It's a weak federation, but it is a federation. Our states, most of our large states are larger than large countries. The state that I am from, West Bengal, is larger than Germany, has more people than Germany. Even like a medium-sized state like Delhi is larger than most countries on the planet. So we're talking of huge, immense things over here. So I think one of the things that the Kovind report lays out with respect to feasibility is that the number of EVMs will go up by 3x. Personnel will be immensely stretched if you try to do all three elections at the same time. So you have all the nuts and bolts, just the bureaucracy, just the red tape of it will be absolutely immense. Coming to the idea of the constitutional feasibility. Now, where we have always got stuck when it comes to simultaneous elections is the fact that by definition in a parliamentary democracy, legislatures and executives do not have fixed terms. It varies, it goes up and down. Legislature can be dissolved a bit like at the pleasure of the executive. Executives could fall and so on and so forth. So we've always got stuck at that proposal. So you've had multiple law commissions, you've had multiple parliamentary committees. The Niti Aayog has put a proposal in 2017, and we're always getting stuck on this. So, for example, there was a parliamentary standing committee in 2015, which had proposed a massive watering down of what is called the no confidence motion in a parliamentary democracy, which is where the legislature can vote out the executive. And very often, sometimes that leads to the formation of a new executive, but sometimes it does not, in which case very often the legislature is dissolved. And this is part of the normal process and life cycle of a legislature in a parliamentary or a Westminster system, except the Parliamentary Standing Committee actually proposed a huge dilution of this and said that you can only have a no confidence motion if there is simultaneously a confidence motion, which means that you cannot actually vote out a government. The legislature cannot vote out a government till it actually votes in a government. Now, this seems kind of like banal on paper, but it's actually a huge reworking of the sort of basis of parliamentary government, because you're actually going to then keep a government in power which really does not have the confidence of the legislature. So you're still going to have that government in power, which is going to be some sort of a weird lame duck government, but it's going to be in power. Remember, I mean, if it's truly a lame duck government in a parliamentary system, it should fall. That's the natural course of events. So that was put in. I think that was a pretty weird and horrific idea. I don't think because it undercuts again the basis of our democracy. The Kovind report kind of sidesteps this. And remember, the Kovind report is what we're working at right now. It's been accepted by the union government. It's been accepted by the Modi government, which means at least in theory, the Modi government is going to be working on the basis of this to implement simultaneous elections. Now, what does the Kovind report put through? Kovind's report basically puts through is that there's firstly going to be one nuclear option where everything's going to be dissolved. You're going to have all three tiers, which is going to be linked to a central election. You're going to have all state assemblies dissolved. You're going to have all local bodies dissolved to reset the clock to one unit, which is then you're going to have simultaneous elections for all of India together. I mean, it actually proposes two tiers. It actually proposes union and state, and then all three together. But basically that's the idea. Now, how does it get over the idea of again deferring terms? So what it says is, it says that if a state assembly is dissolved in the middle of its term, so for example, if there are elections held in 2030 and a state assembly dissolved in 32, so the next round of simultaneous elections will take place in 35. But then it is going to the next state assembly is only going to last for 3 years. So it's only going to last a remainder of that life cycle term, right? This is a solution in a sense that it does not then dilute what is a no confidence motion. A no confidence motion still has the salience that it always had. Of course, this also then raises an immense litany of problems. The first thing is that you are actually decreasing the lifetime of a state assembly. Now, this is a very interesting and almost counterintuitive proposal, because one of the main reasons to back simultaneous elections is that there are too many elections. So there is a certain section of India, there's a certain thought process of India, which I don't agree with. I think elections are great. I think elections are one of the few checks we have on our government, which work very well. So I am pro many number of elections, but there is a very significant body of people who think that too many elections are not great. They disrupt governance, they disrupt policy making, etc., etc., etc. So let's assume they are correct. Unfortunately, it's very unclear how that this proposal would decrease the number of elections, because now, for example, from the point of view of a state, within a 5-year cycle, you have 2 elections, right? So within, say, a 10-year cycle, you might have had 3 elections, while earlier you would only have had 2. So this is a bizarre kind of proposal. Second, the idea that a state will have to have a curtailed assembly just to meet the life cycle of the union legislature is a very odd way to think of Indian federalism. So Indian federalism, of course, constitutionally is a weak form of unitary federalism, but very interestingly, I think politics over the last 7 decades has pushed against the idea. It's almost pushed against the constitutional idea of a unitary federation. And Indian federalism has got stronger and stronger and stronger. Probably pushed by the fact that Indian states are such large and maybe even culturally consistent units. So this sort of popular politics is often pushed against the centralization tendency of maybe the Constituent Assembly. This again is a pulling back of that, right? You have now very, very distinct politics in states. For example, Tamil Nadu has a politics which is so distinct that it is completely divorced from parties in the center. Both parties in the center, Congress earlier and the BJP now, have almost no presence in Tamil Nadu. And there are many examples of this all throughout. One of the very interesting things that I, for example, find is when Andhra Pradesh gets divided, right? It's so incredible that as a border is pulled through the half of these Telugu speaking lands, the politics also bifurcates, right? The TDP then goes back and retreats to what is Andhra, and a new party comes up in Telangana. The Congress, which was so big and united Andhra, actually gets a huge setback in what is now Andhra and is now coming back in Telangana. So the states have a very, very important and very organic bottom-up politics that is partially dependent on the fact that their elections are their own thing. This pulls it back, right? Now we'll have to see whether voters are sophisticated enough to still go through this, to have the split ticket in their heads. But it still puts up a separate step for them to go ahead. So which is an odd thing for me to think of. These are the sort of like almost conceptual issues that I have with this. What the Modi government proposes is it proposes constitutional amendments to try and push this through. And I'll come to another conceptual issue later with respect to electoral laws, but I just want to get over the lifetime of the assemblies. It actually proposes constitutional amendments to both to synchronize state elections as well as to synchronize assembly elections. For constitutional amendments to synchronize state elections, the Kovin report says actually that the ratification of the state assemblies is not required. Now, I don't think this is correct. I think because this affects India's federal structure. And according to the third tier of amendment, this does require ratification of 50% of state assemblies. The Kovin report summarily says it does not. Ideally, they should obviously go to court, and I think that there's a very high chance that this would get decided in favor of the states. So that's number one. It seemed like an unusual proposal to put forward, because if state elections don't decide federal structure of India, then what does? Secondly, for local bodies, it does kind of concede that you do require amendments, you do require ratification by states. But it does seem like the Kovin report is actually not very interested, at least in the short term, of synchronizing local body elections. It is more interested in grabbing the states right now. So local body elections, it says at the stage 2. And the way things are structured in India, unfortunately, is that the third tier is very weak, right? In most cases, the states have an immense control over their local bodies. So in a way, the Kovin report, maybe taking into account this reality, has kept these local bodies at a much lower sort of preference level with respect to states. So we can ignore that. This is an unusual thing to do, constitutionally. B, even if you take the Kovens report at face value and assume that ratification by the states is not required, even then the Modi government is actually going to have a tough time pushing this amendment through. Remember, the Modi government right now is a coalition government. Far from it having the numbers in the Rajya Sabha, it does not have the numbers to push it through in the Lok Sabha, right? It would be quite unlikely that the parties that it is allying with would support this in the Lok Sabha, and Rajya Sabha, it would seem like the numbers just don't add up to it. It's a very interesting and maybe almost like a thought exercise to think why Modi is doing this, why is he pushing this through when the chances of it succeeding are so low. And then we'll obviously go into the area of speculation, which is what I love to do. So I think Modi wants to have push through this because he's done this, and it requires a sense of continuity with his earlier term. So he's almost sort of willing us to forget the election that happened earlier this year, and he's trying to push through this strongman image. He knows he's probably not going to succeed, but this has been a core of his politics, along with things like Kashmir and along things like GST, and he wants to have that continuity going through. So I think it's an important political push to go through, even if the chances of it going through administratively are low. Number one. Remember, I mean, Modi in this term actually has struggled to push through even very minor things like lateral entry in the IS. So, which is, you know, almost like a apparatchik move, like a small move that will not even affect anything in the popular realm other than maybe reservations as an idea. So the fact that it will push through such a fundamental reorganization of the Indian Federation, of how popular politics is conducted, is unlikely. So that is, I mean, the chances of it being unlikely. I put a pin on the idea of electoral rolls, and I want to come back to that because I think that is one of the things that everybody has overlooked in the Kovind report. It is one of the most interesting proposals. It actually says, so right now what happens in India is the states and the union prepare their own electoral rolls, right? And they're used differently in many different ways. What the Kovind report proposes is that to centralize all electoral rolls under Delhi, right? Now, this might seem like a banal and a very, thing without any import and any significance. Excuse me, except what we've seen over, honestly, the last 5 or 10 years. Unfortunately, in India, the process of creating an electoral roll is getting more and more contested, right? In a way, India almost joins like the average of countries or democracies where the idea of an electoral roll, of who is on the electoral roll, is highly contested. I mean, you know, it is an idea that is contested, for example, in the United States. We just had its election. Who is allowed to vote is critical once you've decided that everyone can vote, right, which is now an accepted principle across the world for the last half century plus. The only place where you have now leeway to leave out groups that you think are already inimical to you when you're in the government is to play around with electoral roll. And we've seen a lot of allegations swirling around in the United States with respect to this. India, through some incredible miracle, did not have a lot of controversies around this, except over the last decade. Now we are constantly seeing controversies around the creation of electoral roll. We've reported on this in Scroll, where there have been a lot of doubts raised in how the electoral roll is made. There has been research, there has been a paper published by Sabyasachi Das, which actually lays this out, which actually has a lot of statistical tests which just show that there are contests going on in electoral rolls which are quite contested, which are quite bitter. So in a way, one of the most interesting proposals of the Kovind report is this centralized electoral roll. And remember this, the chances of it actually going through are actually quite a lot larger, just this, than actually the synchronization of all simultaneous elections. And that is what, you guys are researchers and we guys are journalists need to keep an eye on, because that is an interesting little nugget that everybody's missed, and I think is very, very important, both for the BJP's politics, India's politics, and India's federalism. That's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your very interesting points. We'll come back to those later, but now I would like to leave the floor to Nilanjan. Thank you.
You're able to see it.
Yes, we can. Oh,
Sorry,
not anymore.
No, sorry. Mistake.
Yes.
You can. Okay. So these are not serious slides. They're mainly just, some things that I can keep on the screen that I can also focus my own thoughts. I think my jumping off point, which is, something that Shoaib also mentioned, right? Which is, why would you do this now, right? I mean, let's sort of think about there is a question of continuity, but of course, everyone has seen the most recent national election. The BJP didn't do so well in a state like Uttar Pradesh. It didn't do well in a state like Maharashtra. It didn't do well in a state like West Bengal. You might think that if there were electoral benefits to be had, or carry-on effects from a central election to a state election, this last election is not a good demonstration of the kind of carry-on effects you might want, right? In three of the largest states in the union, the BJP seems to have underperformed, right? So I think what I wanted to do was to reconstruct maybe something that might be more of a general logic for why the BJP may have wanted one nation, one election, and something that is beyond electoral logic. So I'll go over the electoral logic a little bit, but I think there are organizational logics that make a lot of sense for the BJP for why it may want to centralize elections at this level. And I completely agree with what Shoaib is saying, which is that it's a bit of a long shot, right? I mean, I think right now getting something like this through, this kind of large administrative reform would be very difficult for the BJP. I just go a step further, say that even when the BJP's had power, its ability to execute something that is large, like demonetization, CAA, NRC, has been remarkably poor, right? Because the ability to declare and the ability to execute are two sort of very, very different things. Okay, so a couple of starting points here. So what might be the incentives for the BJP? So the one obvious thing is that if you have one election, you believe, at least in the short term, that you have somebody like Prime Minister Modi who is helming the party, then you don't have to sort of trot out Modi to every single state election. You can just do it all at once, right? There is some kind of an overarching Modi factor. Prime Minister Modi, despite the last national election, continues to be a very, very popular political leader. And there are certain competitive benefits to be had, right? The second thing, I'll talk a little bit more about this a couple of slides later, is that, one of the benefits of doing a single election or very few elections instead of very many elections when it comes to this kind of thing is that you can have one consistent message across all of the states, right? So one of the challenges that you face, in a polity where you start caring about state elections, where certain chief ministers might start accruing power to themselves, like Yogi Adityanath, Himanta Biswa Sharma, is that actually, from the standpoint of the organization, if you are interested in centralized control, you're interested in keeping a single message, not sort of diversifying your messages across state elections. A second sort of characterization, this is sort of what I always try to encourage people to think about, is think beyond electoral motivations for one nation, one election. So the one thing that we do know about the BJP, it has been true for a long time, it continues to be true, is that organizational and financial resources accruing to the BJP are unparalleled, right? When we think about a very large party having to run its party outfit across multiple states at multiple levels, what kind of organization, what kind of money do you need to be able to do that? Just to give a simple example, we know that a party like the Aam Aadmi Party has been interested in spreading its popularity across the country. If it had to run in Punjab, Delhi, and Gujarat all at once, as opposed to one at a time, what kind of resources would be required coming into the party in one shot versus the way in which it's able to sort of mobilize for each state? So in many ways, by requiring a huge financial, sort of the cost of contesting an election at scale goes way up, right? By sort of generating that condition, you lock in only a very small number of parties that can compete across a large tract of country. And the third thing, which is, sort of been one of my sort of favorite hobby horses, I was talking to Diego about this earlier, which is that we should always understand what is being proposed from the center as not necessarily something that is being done for the country as a whole, but for what it is going to do within the party itself. The problem with being able to run state elections separately across time is that different state level leaders start developing brands themselves, like Yogi Adityanath, like Himanta Biswa Sharma, right? There are Yediyurappa at some point, right? That hurts your ability to centralize all power within the party, particularly when the party is looking a bit weaker. You are interested in centralizing all political attribution, centralizing all structure, right? And that is how these guys tend to look at things. Okay, so just some. This is the 2019 election, not the 2024 election. I'm using national vote shares for, but just to sort of give the contextual point here. It is always the case, almost always the case, that where the BJP is winning and where it is strong, its vote shares are significantly higher in national elections than state elections. So you might think, okay, well, the most recent Haryana election bucked that trend. Actually, it's not true. In the national election, I think the BJP got 46% vote share, and the state election got 40% vote share. So it's closer, but still not the same. So one imagination for why you want to centralize elections, one nation, one election, is to be able to sort of get some of these vote benefits from the national election to the state election. Will this sort of creep up a couple of percentage points, and will that be consequential for the number of seats? So there is some work on this. So Apurav Bhatia, actually with Sabyasachi Das and another co-author, have written about simultaneous elections. Now, the findings are a little bit tricky. The empirical study is actually quite interesting, right? I mean, so what they're essentially looking at are very similar sets of constituencies that may or may not have had a simultaneous election, and then doing a voter survey to understand what's happening and how they're. Now the argument is very simple, and I think one of the things that Shoaib says cuts against that. I tend to agree with Shoaib that there are increasingly voters are quite sophisticated in split ticket voting, but there might be some small percentage of voters who are using cognitive heuristics, right? So they're going to do straight ticket voting. So if I kind of support the BJP abstractly at this point in time, I'll just vote for BJP at every level, right? Now, what they do find across time in simultaneous elections is first, and I think in some ways the more interesting thing is that in simultaneous elections, your ability to localize your logic goes down. So the salience of party vis-a-vis the candidate goes way up, actually, in a simultaneous election. The second thing they show as a function of this is that it's much more likely, 20% more likely in specifically, that the way you vote at the center is also going to be how you vote at the state level in a simultaneous election, right? There can be some critiques about the quantitative methodology here, but I think the magnitude of these effects is pretty clear. Okay. There's another paper that I think Shoaib referred to obliquely, because I think the Kovind report refers to it, by Prachi Mishra and N.K. Singh, which is actually a very bad paper, but we should talk about it. It's been cited, right, that simultaneous elections help economic outcomes. The logic here is that If you have one election as opposed to multiple elections, investors have a regular calendar. There isn't, the kind of event sort of displacement that happens from conducting an election. And so these are reasons why you might expect that the economy is going to do better and investors will do better. The problem is, for any of us who do any level of basic statistics, this is a pretty questionable paper. Essentially, what it boils down to is they are comparing elections at one period in time versus another period in time, and that's certainly not the way to figure out how much simultaneous elections matter. Okay, so this is a little bit about the research that's there. So there is research to suggest that there will be an electoral benefit for the party at the center if there are simultaneous elections, right? If state and national elections are held at the same time. There's some attempts to understand about the overall economic well-being, but I think that's still in a questionable. Okay. Now the second thing, right? And I sort of mentioned this earlier, we want to think about resource mobilization, right? So one sort of question, right, is what kind of resources can you mobilize at once? I mentioned this earlier, right? So if we think of a smaller party with fewer resources, the ability to contest in multiple elections across time gives you a hope. If we think about, I gave you the example of the Aam Aadmi Party earlier, but let's think about the Congress Party, right? The Congress Party, when it was shrinking in terms of its resources, had the capacity to just fundraise for the election that was coming up and contest that at the state level against the BJP. Now, if you have to contest all state elections at once and you are a national party, what kind of resources is the Congress going to require to compete against the BJP, right? So that's sort of one point. The second issue is that national parties have some benefit in this game versus regional parties, right? So national parties can at least offload some of the costs of resource mobilization for a state election to an overall national message, right? So the BJP can push out an entire national message across the country. If you're the TMC and you're looking to spread into 2 or 3 other states, you're going to have to invest in 2 or 3 more states, right? So you can actually, subsidize some of your state level costs with national elections, right? The other obvious thing the BJP benefit the BJP enjoys is what it has at the polling booth level, Panna Pramukhs, right? They have people who are operating at the level of just a few voter list pages and the RSS. So they have a built-in cadre that can work at scale, which very few parties have. And they have the capacity to reach citizens at scale much more cheaply because of media control and so the media machine the BJP has. So if you do a huge election at once, yes, it's a huge resource mobilization, but it's also cheaper for the BJP to contest an election like this than it is for regional parties to contest an election like this because of all of these subsidizing costs that are built into the way the election is run. Final set of points, and then I think I have about 2 minutes, right? Is that right? I think, maybe, yeah. Is to think a little bit about what is happening within the party, right? So one of the benefits of for Prime Minister Modi and Amit Shah of having to have a single election across the country is that where's the electoral strategy coming from? It's coming from the top. And so certain people who have at times been able to play key roles in designing electoral strategy at the state level, whether it be Yediyurappa in Karnataka, Shivraj Singh Chauhan in Madhya Pradesh, or people who are in power today, Yogi Adityanath, Himanta Biswa Sharma, you don't have to worry as much about their inputs and their complexities because it's all being designed from the top. It's one national strategy. It weakens the position of state level leaders and factions vis-a-vis Prime Minister Modi within them. The second issue is that it's going to force local dissidents, right? So we have certain complexities within the party. Nitin Gadkari, Shivraj Singh Chauhan has been pushed aside. Raman Singh has been pushed aside, right? These are powerful state level leaders who have been pushed aside. Now, their factions matter a lot when a state election is being contested individually, right? We saw that with Shivraj Singh Chauhan. When now you have an entire national election, their relative contribution to the entire national project is significantly less, right? So by centralizing in this way, you also weaken the position of state-level dissidents to cause problems for Prime Minister Modi and Amit Shah, and they have been in various ways. And the final thing is, of course, if you control the way that a party runs its campaign from the top, you're going to make sure to claim all the credit yourself. And it's something that we've seen with Prime Minister Modi in the past. It's something I've written about also, right? Part of the reason why you see this kind of national state gap is that in national elections, people are sort of attributing welfare delivery to Prime Minister Modi and not their state level leaders, right? And this only sort of strengthens that position. So just final thought, just before I pass it back to Diego. Yes, there are electoral motivations. There's a lot of research to suggest that there are electoral motivations. But to me, the main motivations for the BJP to continue pushing on something like this, A, of course, continuity, but B, even despite the electoral results that we've recently seen in 2024, it is actually consistent with their resource advantages and their organizational advantages in India. And more importantly, it aligns very closely with the political incentives of Prime Minister Modi and Amit Shah to centralize power within their own political party. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nilanjan. And last but not least, I would like to invite Luis to join us, who I think also has some slides to show. Luis, to you.
Yeah, thank you. You just work out how to share. Okay. Hopefully that can be seen. Okay.
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much, and thank you, Diego, for inviting me to speak after Shoaib and Nilanjan, because I think they've set out the ground here very nicely and much better than I could have done. So I'm glad to be going last. You had invited me to reflect here on the implications for Indian federalism, and I think we've already heard quite a lot now of the concerns that the One Nation, One Elections proposal poses for federalism. I wanted to think through a little more what the proposals mean, and to pick up a little from where Nilanjan's left off, to think about the intersection between the implications for the party system of simultaneous elections and federalism. So I think the first thing to say is that if we read either any of the reports that have been published over the last 8 years about simultaneous elections, we are advised not to worry about the implications for Indian federalism. So if we take the view of the Law Commission report in 2018 or the Kovind report in 2024, both of these reports dismiss any suggestion that the simultaneous elections proposal really has any implications for federalism whatsoever. And the reports do that by presenting a very reductive idea of what Indian federalism is, and focusing solely on federalism as the division of legislative competencies, of the distribution of powers between two levels of government. So this is the simple idea that India is federal because it is a dual polity and that powers are distributed across two levels of government. And because this proposal does not propose any changes to the 7th schedule and to the distribution of powers, therefore we shouldn't be concerned that it raises any potential changes to the structure of Indian federalism. So the Kovind Committee goes as far as to state that Indian federalism is not based on geographical considerations, but simply relies on these systematic and structural principles, and it sets out what those are, i.e. the distribution of powers. So at one level, perhaps not much to be concerned about, but for the critics, of course, we have in mind a rather richer and deeper understanding of what federalism in India is, namely that it's not only about a division of power, but it's also about an idea of federalism which does have a geographical reality, and in which federalism as a set of territorialized institutions represent and protect regional and ethnic diversity. So the basic point here is that how we evaluate the implications of one nation, one election for federalism depends on our understanding of what Indian federalism is in the first place. The other thing that I think which is important to keep in mind is that the one nation, one election proposal doesn't stand on its own. So firstly, it follows on from a host of other one nation reforms, which I reminded us about at the beginning. We've had one nation, one tax, the GST, with one nation, one ration card, one nation, one grid, a whole host of one nation policies. And so this, the optics around this appear very much as, part of a journey towards an attempt to centralise power and to enhance a more unitary conception of India. As well as that, the proposal is being pushed at a time when there are other debates that are very live about the nature of the federal bargain more generally. So not only one nation, one election, but we also anticipate within a few years that we will see a process of delimitation. And we have a raging debate about fiscal federalism as well. So there are a lot of pieces of India's federal bargain that are up in the air at the moment. So it's quite hard to think about one nation, one election in isolation from any of those other pieces. But I'll do my best to try and disentangle and to think solely about the impact of simultaneous elections on federalism. I think one of the, sorry, I'm just going to minimize the video because I can't see my own slides, that's better. One of the main concerns of the one nation, one election proposal is the impact on party system nationalisation. And Nilanjan has just showed us some slides which provide some data which supports the notion that simultaneous elections are potentially likely to favour the national incumbent party, or the party with the kind of dominance that the BJP has in India, that they're likely to lead to the prioritisation of national issues over state-specific issues, and to favour parties that have a cross-state or nationwide presence as compared to regional parties. And in the wider political science literature on these questions, there are two interrelated concerns here. One is that one level of election may be permanently reduced to what are often called second-order elections. This is a way of thinking about the prioritisation of different levels of elections, which comes out of the European Union initially. So the notion in Europe that elections to the European Parliament are less important to voters than those to their national parliament. But in the context of simultaneous elections in India, the logic would be reversed, so that national elections to the Lok Sabha would become more important to voters than their elections to state assemblies. And that this would really bake in some of what's been happening in India over the last decade with the consolidation of the new BJP dominant party system, in which Lok Sabha elections have gained again a kind of preeminence, which in the era between 1989 to 2014 had been diluted as state assembly elections gained greater prominence in the eyes of voters. So that's the first concern. And then the second concern is that the outcome of national and state elections would become more congruent, that you'd have less split ticket voting if elections were held simultaneously than you do in the present setup. So what do we know from the comparative evidence on this? Nilanjan has shown us some of the recent work on India. I thought it might be useful just to talk briefly about what we know from other federal countries or countries with multi-level elections about the implications of simultaneous elections for party system nationalisation. So there is certainly evidence from a number of federal countries that have simultaneous elections, or have at different points in time had simultaneous elections, which suggests that the electoral outcomes do tend to be more congruent and do tend towards nationalisation. So to favour polity-wide parties, national parties and national issues over regional parties and regional issues. But there is also evidence from other kinds of multi-ethnic polities where we see the opposite. So note here that Brazil, Argentina, US and Canada are all federal systems in which federal subunits, regional governments, are not organised along ethnic lines. These are kind of mono-national federations compared to India or other federal polities where internal borders are drawn along ethnic lines. So in Ukraine, for instance, where simultaneous elections were introduced in 2006, a country again where of course there's a lot of regional ethnic variation. Research there on the impact of simultaneous elections showed that simultaneous elections did not, in fact, lead to greater congruence between election outcomes at both levels, and the voters continued to split their ticket, so to speak. So they voted for a different party at national elections and in regional elections. So I think the evidence, the point I'm trying to make here really is that the evidence comparatively doesn't offer a single picture about the implications of simultaneous elections on for the nature of party system nationalisation. So in India, we might find a number of things. We might find that simultaneous elections, in simultaneous elections, voters might continue to split their ticket. And I think both Shoaib and Nilanjan have spoken about, the fact that voters are quite increasingly canny, and we see where state elections and Lok Sabha elections are held in reasonably close to each other, that election outcomes can vary quite a lot. I've also done some recent work that's just been published with a number of co-authors looking at the way that voters attribute credit for different programmes, which also suggests that voters are actually rather better than we often assume at disentangling which level of government is responsible for what. So even in the case of credit attribution, and even in a landscape where we've seen a lot of credit centralisation, voters are actually able to differentiate what their state government is constitutionally responsible for and what the central government is constitutionally responsible for. So you might think that when elections are held on the same day, voters might make different decisions at both levels. I think it is more likely that we will see greater congruence, simply because most voters don't spend that much time, I think, making their decisions on a kind of carefully balanced assessment of which level of government does what and which kind of party they want to govern at both levels. So I think it is quite likely that congruence will increase as a result of simultaneous elections. But I think it's not the case that simultaneous elections will permanently favour either national or regional parties or issues. So it is quite possible, and I think given the nature of the recent Lok Sabha elections and the resurgence of local and state-specific issues in those elections, that introducing one nation, one election now might have a regionalising impact on political life as much as a nationalising one. And I think it's worth remembering, I think, the historical irony here, which is that when national and state elections were first delinked by Indira Gandhi in 1971, she did so in an effort to refocus voters' attention on the national political landscape. so the opposite motivation than that is pushing the idea of one nation, one election. Now, in that she wanted to have separate state elections and separate Lok Sabha elections, so that voters during the Lok Sabha elections were focused on national issues rather than being distracted by what was going on at the state level. And this was, of course, in the context in which the Congress Party had just started to lose in the 1967 state elections a swathe of state level elections. So, I think that's a nice reminder, really, of the cyclical nature of nationalisation and regionalisation within Indian political life. I think there's no necessary reason to think that one nation, one election will permanently nationalise India's political life. And so, to conclude, the implications, and I haven't spoken in these remarks about where Shoaib started, about the Coven Committee report propositions on state assembly tenure. And I think those do raise other questions for federalism as well. But if we're thinking about federalism and the implications of party system nationalisation for federalism, I think the implications of one nation, one election are somewhat unclear for federalism. I think, taken just on their own, there's good reason to think that simultaneous elections could support the regionalisation, the strengthening of the regional dimensions of political life as much as their nationalisation. But as I started out with, one nation, one election is not being proposed in a vacuum. It is very much in line with a series of other policy reforms which really push a much more restricted interpretation of what federalism is in India, and driven by a party with a much more unitary mindset. And I think it is impossible really to think through the implications for federalism without linking one nation, one election to the other kinds of changes that are potentially on the anvil, which have the potential to disrupt and open up the federal bargain in much broader and deeper ways. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Louise. I propose I do a first round of questions for all of you, and then and in the meanwhile invite people in the audience to pose their question through the Q&A section of Zoom. So I have one thought exercise for all of you that I would like to take, which is, do you think that if Modi hadn't become the Prime Minister of India, but remained the Chief Minister of Gujarat, would he favored this proposal, or would he back this proposal as a Chief Minister of State? And this is a way to say, do you think that the BJP Chief Ministers are behind these proposals? And if no, does it actually matter, given the state of things? That is the short question for all of you. But I also want to ask again all of you if thinking about how this could backfire in a way. Like, for example, Nilanjan, you said that simultaneous election could mean having a consistent message, like a national message versus a regional message. But could this actually backfire? Because if we look at electoral data, when the BJP treat a state election as a national elections, it usually goes not that well. So that could backfire, and could backfire in many other ways, right? Coalition partners might, anyway. Which bring us to my last point. Point to reflect, which is that maybe when we think about the motivations behind this move, maybe, as Louise was suggesting, this is a big ideological project that the BJP wants to carry forward, which has many parts. It's a one nation, one civil code. It's one nation, one language. It's one nation, one. I mean, they haven't gone that far, but one nation, one religion in an ideal world. And etc. So I would like you to say something about the possibility that we always discard, that people at the top of a political system are completely rational actors that do this with a cost-benefit analysis. But sometimes they are just ideologically driven, and they try and do things even if they have very low possibility of realizing them, even if it will become difficult to administer, even if it could backfire. But it's part of a ideological agenda. I suggest we take your second round of comments. Please keep it brief, if possible, within 5 minutes each, in the order we started. So, Shoaib, to you.
I think for the Modi thing, we have a very interesting answer in GST. So Modi was a trenchant critic of the GST when he was chief minister, and then he was the one who, with a lot of political skill, even if we ignore the other negative effects of GST, that piloted it through. So I don't think there is a lot of doubt in that. As Nilanjan had sort of brought up earlier, not only does this affect state parties, but it affects state satraps within the BJP. Remember, the BJP, just like Indira Gandhi once did, the BJP has been a relentless machine that cuts down its own state leaders. And in some ways, it is also a weakness. So that is also, in a way, the answer to your third question, that this relentless centralization that Nilanjan sort of mentioned, the fact that all power is going to be centralized in, say, a Modi or an Amit Shah and so on, might help Modi and Amit Shah in the short term, but the sort of the 5 or 10-year outlook of that is not very difficult to see, because we've seen it happen to the Congress. One of the main reasons of the Congress's decline was too much high command, too much centralization. So, the centralization is great till it works, and then it's not, right? So still Modi is very, very popular, till Modi is a vote catcher. This is going to be great, but there is going to be a day, one day, even if it's, we've already seen it, the Modi star is dimming to some extent, that the thing is going to switch, and it's going to be albatross around the BJP's neck. Sorry, what was the second question again?
Good question. It was, if this could potentially backfire.
Right. No, that was the third, right? Okay, so right. Sorry, I should have.
The ideological project?
Right. So, I said the third, sorry. I think there's certainly an ideological project at play here. The BJP, I mean, if you go back to, say, Golwalkar is against the idea of states. And remember, Golwalkar is like, sorry, not Golwalkar, forgetting his name. One of the RSS is forgetting his name. But anyway, the RSS has always been against the idea of states. So this idea that states have their own politics, have their own trajectories, is something that mitigates against what the BJP believes in. So I certainly think it's an ideological project. It's a very good point of view, because I think we sometimes are very focused on this idea that they're completely rational and they're going to get a benefit out of it. But it's clear that at least Modi and the BJP have long-term ideological projects that have no direct fruition. And just the idea that we're discussing this on this seminar is, in a way, a small victory for the BJP, right? The fact that it's in the discourse, that we are discussing this, we're debating it, it's in our minds, is, I think, already a small little win.
Thank you. Nilanjan.
So I mean, the issue is that I think probably all three of us will agree with each other on this. So I agree with most of Shoaib's assessment. So let me take this in a slightly different direction. So first of all, this thing that Shoaib said about, he was Prime Minister Modi was against GST before he was, for it. The Twitter of Prime Minister Modi pre-2014 and Twitter of Prime Minister Modi post-2014 is the gift that keeps on giving, right? If there are these people who do these like little side by side, it's like literally just complete flips, right? I mean, it's an amazing, it's amazing thing, right? But I think the way to sort of think about this centralization project within the BJP, right? Modi as a chief minister versus Modi as a prime minister, is to, let's now put the question to Congress, right? And why might this not be a good idea for Congress? Let's say Congress were in the exact same position as the BJP. See, today it's of course much diminished, but we still tend to think of the Congress system as operating in some way. A Gaylord, although maybe not now, given it is, matters. A Siddaramaiah matters, right? You are winning elections on the charisma of some of your state level leaders, right? That is a large part of how the Congress party operates. If all of a sudden you move to a system like this, how does a Congress party structure its appeal? Is it going to have to be completely about Rahul Gandhi? Is it going to be a Rahul Gandhi versus Modi fight? Is that might be what Prime Minister Modi wants, right? Whereas if it's a fight between state level political leaders and regionalized politics, often Congress has the upper, right? So I think obviously from the standpoint of a state political leader, this is not a very good outcome. National issues will matter more. There's centralizing features within the party, but also it speaks to the unique structure of what Prime Minister Modi has done with the BJP, that we tend to think that an entire national party can be centralized like this. In many ways, what we saw in this previous election with this talk of the BJP washing machine, right, is this idea that the BJP, now that it's gotten so big, it has to start operating like Congress once did, right? Now it needs to start buying people from the other side. There are all kinds of weird factions. So you have these structural tendencies towards what the Congress party once became, this sort of catch-all party. But you have an internal imagination of hyper-centralization. And so that's why I think sometimes you see some of these funny things like we're going to buy off half of Congress, but we're also going to try to centralize within the party, right? I mean, this sort of thing is happening. Now, can it backfire? I mean, it will backfire, right? I mean, I think let's be very clear about this, right? I mean, I think we've all seen enough politics that that 5-10 years down the line, when we have to think of who a successor to Prime Minister Modi is, that's when it will backfire. And somebody actually, I was talking to somebody who is involved in Kashmir's politics, and why the BJP did so badly. This was actually before the election results came. He said, look, those of us who were defectors and running independent parties, and there was a time when we believed that you could ally with Prime Minister Modi. Prime Minister Modi is going to stick around. He's going to protect you, and I'll also gain something out of it. Today, who is willing to take that bet in Kashmir? Based on the last national election, it is not in your best interest to ally yourself to Prime Minister Modi and think about what's going to happen 5-10 years down the line. So so I think the centralization has its limits, and the dark side of what could happen is actually going to come pretty soon. And so the sort of final point here, right, which is this ideological project. I mean, I think I completely agree, but one of the things that I find fascinating for those of us who do comparative politics or comparative sociology, it's like centralizing or creating a common view on the cheap. So in our literature, what do we tend to think of, right? Party systems, people have either social cleavages or ideological binding. The reason why, whether or not elections are simultaneous, you'll have Democrats contesting at the state level, the county level, the national level, even in a very federal system, right, is because there is some kind of partisan or ideological bind, right? And the imagination that you can kind of structurally push people towards one way of thinking or to one national imagination, rather than sort of doing the hard work of investing in ideas, right, is, I think, a weak imagination. It might be that those ideas exist within the RSS, right? It might be those ideas exist, but to believe that somehow creating a certain kind of structure with elections is going to create that kind of imagination within voters is something that is actually quite peculiar, given the way that we tend to think about party systems as a whole. So in the short term, you might actually get this sort of jump up for the BJP voter in simultaneous elections. But I think pretty quickly, these kinds of regional factors and caste-wise factors, all the things that we've talked about, would make it just sort of go back to what it's always been. So that's it.
Thank you. Luis, to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add, really. I mean, the point I kind of totally agree with Nilanjan there, and that's where I was kind of leaving things in my opening remarks, in that I don't think one nation, one elections on their own are going to achieve an alignment of political views from top to bottom in India. It just, it's just inconceivable that would be the case. And so I think that we've already seen regional issues rear their head in the Lok Sabha elections this year, and that will happen too, whether elections are simultaneous or not. And I just wanted to pick up, I think, on your last question, really, about this as part of a wider ideological project, which I really think is key here. I mean, the BJP, in its history, looking back to the Jansang as well, made a very temporary accommodation with the idea, an acceptance of the idea that India was a multi-ethnic federation. Initially, the Jansang was opposed to linguistic reorganization of states. It was opposed to making special concessions to states which had large Christian minority populations. Of course, we know the history of the BJP, the Jansang, and then the BJP's attitudes towards Article 370 and Kashmir. This is a party that has made over time a gradual and limited accommodation to the idea of India as a multi-ethnic federation. And it is very rapidly pivoting away from that accommodation, but it needed to make the accommodation as part of its rise to power as a national party. So, if we look at how the BJP from the late 1980s and 1990s broke through in new parts of the country, it was by supporting statehood movements, developing a foothold in new parts of the country through its accommodation with regional political movements and regional political life. And that time will come again. And as I think we've all said, the consequence, the BJP will not be able to survive forever with a hyper centralized, modus operandi that hinges around Modi and Amit Shah. It will have to regionalize at some point, in the future. And I think the same is true for the Congress Party. I mean, I was thinking how, Nilanjan's kind of poser about what would this mean for Congress and its kind of chief minister centric mode of election campaigning at the moment. And I'm not completely sure whether that much would have to change. I mean, it would actually be in the interests of non-BJP parties to make elections in a simultaneous environment focus even more on state-specific issues and state-specific leaders. That will be where the BJP would be most vulnerable. So I think well, we've all explored really that the logic driving this has to be more than the electoral payoffs for the BJP. It really is part of a kind of wider ideological project, and maybe that's the answer to the puzzle that Shoaib started. Well, both Shoaib and Nilanjan started with. Why would the BJP push this at this moment if it's not going to succeed? Well, it's because they want to push the idea as much as the reality of its realization.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I also think this ideological angle is really the driver of much of extremist, because this is what we're talking about, conducting of politics. In my own country, we have an extremist as a prime minister, and sometimes the government does things that are not really logical. They even hurt them on highly ideological things like abortion, or we have seen in the US as well that the Republican Party was pushing something on abortion that was most of the party itself, the party base, was against. Anyway, so we have two questions from the audience. One we have kind of answer it, which ask about to say a little bit more about the political difficulties of getting this proposal through both houses of parliament. And it says, I'm also puzzled as to why PM Modi BJP would want to push this through, even if the chances of success are low, taking into account explanation of continuity, strong governance, and etc. To which we might add the very fact of pushing the idea is probably a reason in itself. And the second question for whoever wants to take it is: do the speaker think that there are strong business interests baking the One Nation, One Election project, whether local or multinational companies? Any idea on this?
I can maybe I can start with the second one. Obviously we're completely in a speculative world here. So first I should say I want to thank Diego for putting this on, also because I think the first time in several days I haven't had to comment on Trump and the US election, right? This is finally back to doing what I actually do. But this is a question that we might ask in the US today, right? I mean, this is why I sort of thought about this, right? We might ask about what sort of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and their money is doing. And I just want to highlight one sort of strange feature of what has happened in Indian politics. So Harish Damodharan, who's Indian Express, but was my colleague for a while at CPR, he had written about India's local and regional capitalists, right? And then a couple of years later, this sort of meteoric rise of your Adanis and your Ambanis, and then you had to write about the decline in power of your regional capitalists, right? And so I think that also tells us a little bit about where your interests might be arrayed when it comes to something like state election. So obviously, insofar as a lot of liquid for elections might be local in nature, state-specific in nature, perhaps you don't like the one nation, one election kind of model. But as your political financing model is necessarily something that is at scale, that is across states, you aren't really playing a game other than just to buy off a few people to fund regional parties. You are almost always playing a game to sort of buy power at the national level, right? Because you operate at a national level, you operate across states. And so the reason why large capital would care about one nation, one election is that they are very much invested in certain kinds of political actors and parties winning elections, because regional parties and regional capital is what you're often fighting against.
Thank you. Shoaib, Luis, do you want to add anything on either the feasibility of pushing through Parliament or this business interest question?
I was going to ask a question to Shoaib, if I may, on the first question, which is about getting it through Parliament. Do you have any reflections on where the coalition partners stand on this? I mean, obviously, this would require a 2/3 majority in Parliament, so Modi would need support beyond the coalition. But what's your reading on where the coalition partners themselves are?
And can I add a short question on this as well for you, Shoaib, which is, one way of sometimes of pushing through a difficult piece of legislation is to break it up in small pieces. And I'm asking this out of sheer ignorance. Is it something feasible? For example, the thing you said about the electoral rolls might be, one piece that you push through, and if the other pieces don't go through, you still have gained something. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think electoral, I think, is something that Modi government should push through, which is easy to do, which has a significant amount of benefits. So maybe that is one thing to sort of prize out. And the COVID committee actually also splits up simultaneous elections also in two parts. So one is state and center, and the other is in all three. But of course, other than electoral rolls, the other two are really, really big things to get through. So even if you do split it quite a bit, I'm not sure how much, because the entire whole is so huge that how much splitting would really help in this case. Coming back to what Luis's question was, so firstly, there has actually been very little reporting on what the NDA alliance partners think of this. But if I could just sort of work it out logically for first principles, I do not see a position where they are ready to support this from any sense of their own self-preservation, right? So if you look at Nitish Kumar would be grievously hurt by the idea of simultaneous polls. That said, I mean, so I like I said in my opening remarks, I think it's difficult to do, both for the fact that the high bar that Parliament puts on as constitutional amendment, but also that the NDA itself, the constitution of the NDA might not be pro it. It's literally, you're literally going to solve the branch that you're sitting on. That said, Mr. Modi is a very good politician. He has managed to do this for GST. So he got parties to vote for the GST, which actually harmed them by putting in a short-term carrot, which was compensation, right? And there are some internal, we can go into the weeds of why parties at that time thought it was a good bargain. But clearly, in the medium term, it was a bad bargain for them, no matter what it was in the short term. So whatever we might think again about GST, I thought that was a brilliant political move, tactical political move. So, you know, we should give Mr. Modi his due and credit and wait for it to come in Parliament, and let's see whether he has any tricks up his sleeve like the way he had with compensation.
And why, sorry if I can just ask a follow-up, why haven't the coalition partners gone public if your anticipation is that they are unlikely to support it? Why has it got through cabinet?
I think the understanding is that this is a bit of a show and it's not going to come to fruition soon. So they're not going to rock the boat and pick a fight with the BJP on something, the probability of which coming true, at least in this term, is low. So it's not really a immediate policy that's going to be implemented. So that's my understanding of it. And I think it's from the point of view of the NDA constitution, it's a smart thing because it allows the BJP to do its thing, to posture, to push across ideological project, but it does not harm them in any way.
You would think after 4 years of Zoom, I learned how to unmute myself before talking, but no. Okay, I would like to thank all of our speakers for having joined us. My plan worked. I know a lot more about this idea, the implication, and it's clear to me at least that it's probably more important to having understood that, like, the politics of it rather than the policy itself, which probably will not see the light of the day anytime soon, at least. But let's see what will happen. Thanks again, and thanks everybody for joining. And I'm not sure if Raghav, you have to say some concluding remarks on behalf of ISAS. If yes, I leave the floor to you. Otherwise, I say goodbye and thank you to everyone.
Yeah. So on behalf of ISAS, we would like to extend our thanks to Dr. Diego and our speakers for the insightful engagement event. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Down.
Thank you. Ciao.
Wow.